The end of World War II did not bring an immediate cessation of all military activities. In fact, the dismantling of the wartime infrastructure marked the beginning of a complex and often painful transformation. For the Allied training grounds, the conclusion of active combat was not an end, but a difficult reimagining of their purpose and viability. These vast expanses of land, once brimming with troops and equipment in preparation for battle, now stood eerily silent, awaiting their next fate. This period, from the moment of peace until the definitive closure or repurposing of these sites, was characterized by uncertainty, logistical chaos, and pressing economic considerations. The magnitude of the war effort, particularly in the Allied nations, had been staggering. Millions of soldiers, airmen, and sailors were trained across an expansive network of military facilities. In the United States alone, the number of training camps, airfields, and naval bases during the war reached into the thousands, each one a hub of intense activity and preparation. The facilities ranged from small, temporary camps in rural areas to massive, permanently constructed bases designed to accommodate thousands of service members. In total, the U.S. operated more than 2,000 training camps during the war, a number that would soon be reduced dramatically in the aftermath. With the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 and Imperial Japan in August of that year, the immediate demand for such vast training grounds vanished. The sudden cessation of hostilities rendered many facilities obsolete almost overnight. The U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, along with their British and Commonwealth counterparts, were left with an enormous surplus of military infrastructure that was no longer necessary for active military service. Yet the question of what to do with these sites was far from simple. One of the first steps taken by the U.S. and its allies was the reduction of military personnel. Conscription, which had been a cornerstone of Allied forces during the war, came to an abrupt halt. The U.S. Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1948, ending the wartime draft and establishing a peacetime volunteer army. This shift was not simply a matter of policy but also of necessity, given the immense strain on the nation's economy and the need to focus on rebuilding after the war. The immediate consequence of this was the downsizing of military forces, which in turn led to the closure or downsizing of training grounds. In the United States, more than 400 military bases were closed in the immediate years following the war. This included both training grounds and other facilities that had been crucial to wartime efforts. While some bases were temporarily preserved for possible future conflict, many others were quickly abandoned. The sheer scale of this downsizing was a logistical challenge. Each of these bases had its own infrastructure, including barracks, armories, runways, firing ranges, and medical facilities. The cost of maintaining these facilities during peacetime, with reduced personnel and a diminished sense of urgency, was deemed unsustainable. The decision to close or repurpose them was not only influenced by military strategy but also by economic realities. Repurposing these bases proved to be a common solution. Many training grounds in the U.S. were reassigned for other uses, both military and civilian. Some were handed over to the Department of the Interior and turned into national parks, wildlife refuges, or conservation areas. Others were repurposed for industrial use or turned into storage facilities for military equipment that could not be easily scrapped. A large portion of military bases, however, remained in limbo, their futures uncertain, as the immediate demand for them dwindled. In Britain, the situation was similarly challenging. The British Army had trained thousands of soldiers in various locations, including airfields and training camps across the UK. Following the war, however, the British government was faced with the economic devastation wrought by the war and the necessity of reducing military expenditures. The result was the abandonment of several major training sites. The British government, dealing with post-war austerity, was keen to alleviate the financial burden of maintaining so many facilities. One of the most notable examples was the disbandment of the vast training grounds at Aldershot, which had been a major center of military training for decades. With the post-war reduction in the Army's size, Aldershot was no longer needed on the scale it had once been. The British Army gradually reduced its presence in the region, and large sections of Aldershot were put to new uses, including housing and industry. The story of Aldershot mirrored that of many other British training sites, where the facilities were either sold off or repurposed for civilian use. In Australia, too, the aftermath of the war was marked by significant military downsizing. The Australian government faced similar economic pressures, which meant that many of the country's training grounds were also deemed surplus. Australia's training camps, some of which had been built with the assistance of the United States during the war, were now left with little purpose in the absence of conscription. The economic realities of post-war Australia meant that much of the infrastructure was either sold off or left to deteriorate. The Australian military, which had relied heavily on conscription during the war, soon found itself adjusting to a smaller, professional force. Training grounds were either shut down or transformed into other military functions, such as storage or reserve training areas. At the same time, the rising cost of maintaining a large military establishment led to the decision to scrap large quantities of wartime equipment. Airfields and tanks ranges, once used for live fire exercises and air-to-ground combat drills, became graveyards for equipment that was no longer needed. This included everything from jeeps and trucks to larger vehicles such as Sherman tanks and artillery pieces. In many cases, this material was either sold to scrap dealers or, more often, left to rust in open fields, a symbolic and literal reflection of the rapid transition from war to peace. One of the greatest challenges of this post-war period was managing the vast surplus of military equipment. While some vehicles and weapons were stored for potential future use, much of it was deemed obsolete or beyond economic repair. The post-war arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would soon lead to the Cold War, meant that both sides had to consider the practicalities of maintaining their military strength. For the Allies, particularly the United States and Britain, this meant cutting costs by abandoning or scrapping vast quantities of outdated equipment and structures. This abandonment was not purely physical. The emotional toll on communities surrounding military bases was significant. In some places, military presence had been the backbone of local economies for years. Entire towns had been built around these training grounds, their economies reliant on the influx of military personnel. As the bases closed and the troops left, these communities experienced a profound shift. What had once been vibrant hubs of activity became quiet, forgotten places. Even those bases that were repurposed often left behind a feeling of loss, as entire sections of land that had once been teeming with life and activity fell into disrepair. Amidst these shifts, the question of what to do with the land itself remained unresolved. Some of the bases were returned to their original landowners, but the sheer scale of the closures made this process impractical in many cases. In the U.S., some training grounds were repurposed for civilian use, while others simply sat empty, waiting for a future that seemed uncertain. In Britain, some of the former military sites were turned into housing developments, but the remnants of their military past often remained visible: rusted military hardware, deteriorating buildings, and forgotten airstrips left as vestiges of the war. By the end of 1948, a significant portion of the major Allied training grounds had either been abandoned or repurposed. Yet, for many, the question of what to do with the remaining sites was still unresolved. Economic pressures, military priorities, and social realities meant that the fate of these training grounds remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the landscape had changed irreversibly. The once thriving hubs of military preparation had become monuments to a different era, their futures unwritten and, in many cases, already fading into history. As the 1950s progressed, the fate of the Allied training grounds continued to unfold, shaped by the changing needs of the military and the shifting economic realities of a post-war world. The initial wave of closures and repurposing gave way to more strategic decisions, with some sites transformed into permanent fixtures for reserve and peacetime training, while others were abandoned, left to slowly deteriorate over time. In the United States, the post-war era was dominated by the growing military-industrial complex, and many former training bases were revisited in light of the Cold War. The rise of the Soviet Union as the primary global adversary required both strategic reassessment and military expansion. However, the focus was on modernizing the armed forces rather than preserving outdated infrastructure. As a result, many of the former World War II training grounds, once brimming with activity, were now seen as increasingly irrelevant in the face of the new, more advanced technologies of the Cold War era. The larger, permanent installations, those with substantial infrastructure such as airstrips and barracks, were more likely to be preserved or repurposed. Despite these changes, many of the smaller, temporary training camps were quietly abandoned or sold off. Some of these sites, especially in rural areas, were simply left to rot. The towering concrete structures, once filled with soldiers preparing for battle, were reduced to rusting relics, forgotten by the world. It was an unsettling contrast to the days when these sites had played a pivotal role in preparing soldiers for some of the largest battles in history. Some of the largest bases, however, were adapted for new uses within the military establishment. Old airfields, for instance, were sometimes repurposed as storage depots for the growing stockpiles of military supplies and vehicles. Some camps were converted into reserve training centers, where National Guard and reserve units could continue to train for potential mobilization. In many cases, this transition was marked by an extensive cleanup operation. Equipment that was too outdated or impractical to repurpose, such as the massive stockpile of obsolete tanks, trucks, and artillery, was stripped of useful parts and scrapped. A significant portion of the military's post-war surplus equipment, including much of the war's iconic material, was sent to scrap yards or melted down for its metal content. Even vast quantities of wartime planes, many of which had been parked in large rows at airfields, were dismantled or buried in open fields. The process of scrapping and salvaging this equipment, which had once been seen as indispensable to the war effort, was an incredibly labor-intensive operation. Thousands of men were employed to strip the parts of planes, tanks, and trucks, extracting any materials of value. In some cases, old military vehicles were cut into pieces and sold to scrap dealers, while the remains of obsolete aircraft were reduced to metal that could be reused for future production. Yet, not all training grounds were left to deteriorate. Some were preserved for reserve training, particularly those bases located in strategically important areas or those with large, sprawling layouts. These sites would play an enduring role in the decades following the war. For instance, sites like Fort Benning, Georgia, which had been one of the most important infantry training bases during World War II, continued to serve as an essential hub for military training throughout the Cold War. Fort Benning was not abandoned but instead adjusted to the needs of an evolving military. Many such bases, with their expansive infrastructure, would find new life as centers for advanced training, specializing in fields like parachuting, armor, and artillery. Other sites saw significant repurposing for civilian purposes. Former training grounds, once heavily guarded military sites, were sold to private developers or local governments. In the U.S., for example, military bases in California, Texas, and the Northeast were repurposed for housing and commercial development. As the military downsized and government spending priorities shifted, many former base properties were auctioned off, sold for a fraction of their original construction cost. The once bustling military training hubs were transformed into suburban neighborhoods, shopping centers, and industrial zones. The United Kingdom followed a similar trajectory. In the years following the war, several training sites were closed down entirely. Some, such as the massive training ground at Salisbury Plain, were retained by the military but repurposed for training in a peacetime environment. Other sites, particularly those located in more remote or less economically significant areas, were either abandoned or reallocated for new civilian uses. One of the most notable transformations was the conversion of the former RAF bases into civilian airports. Many of the sprawling airfields, with their long runways and vast tarmacs, became vital hubs for the post-war aviation boom. British civilian airports, such as London Gatwick and Manchester, owe their expansion to this transformation of former military infrastructure. A more controversial repurposing of military sites occurred in Europe, where many former training grounds were returned to their pre-war agricultural uses. Particularly in areas like Germany and France, land that had been requisitioned for military purposes during the war was gradually returned to local farmers. However, this did not always go smoothly. In some instances, the land had been so heavily contaminated with unexploded ordnance or other remnants of war that it was unsuitable for agricultural use for many years after the conflict. The extensive use of chemical agents and explosives during training exercises and warfare left behind an environmental legacy that could not be easily undone. Moreover, the psychological toll on those who had lived through the war, particularly in areas directly affected by the conflict, created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty as local communities were faced with readapting to a post-war world. One particularly troubling issue was the ongoing cost of maintaining or dismantling former military sites. In some cases, the economic burden of keeping a military facility open for minimal use was seen as untenable, and governments were forced to make difficult decisions. In the United States, for instance, the costs of maintaining unused military bases, especially in remote locations, were often viewed as an unnecessary drain on national resources. This led to further base closures in the years following the end of World War II. However, these decisions were not always popular, as communities that had once relied on military facilities for jobs and economic support felt the blow of such closures deeply. The transition from wartime to peacetime had far-reaching economic consequences, as towns and cities that had been built around training grounds now faced the prospect of economic stagnation. As the Cold War deepened, however, some of the former training grounds once abandoned or repurposed were revived for new military purposes. The strategic importance of certain sites was not lost on military planners, particularly as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated. Some training grounds were reactivated as part of the expansion of the NATO alliance. These sites, originally built for training troops during World War II, were updated with new facilities and technologies to accommodate the needs of a rapidly modernizing military force. While many bases were sold or converted into civilian developments, a significant number were reactivated for Cold War-era training.